If you have to perform an internal audit in your company but you don't know where to start, then this video is for you. So I'll explain you what is the process of performing an internal audit, how to create an internal audit checklist, and which kind of qualifications does an internal auditor need to have in order to become one. I'll also show you what kind of topics are included in a typical internal auditor course. And after you watch this video, you'll have a clear idea on what kind of internal audit you need to perform in order to be accepted by the certification auditor. And I made this video not only for novice internal auditors, but also for ISO 27001 project managers and for security officers who are in charge actually of running an ISMS and who have to actually perform an internal audit as part of their implementation of this standard. And to learn more about ISO 27001, click this button below to subscribe to my YouTube channel. The purpose of an internal audit is for a company to find out if everyone in the company is following security policies and procedures and other rules related to security. Because if this was not verified, then you would have a chaos and you wouldn't really know if everything was compliant properly or not. So this is the way to systematically actually go through each and every requirement, not only of the standard, but also of your internal documentation to verify these things. And internal audit needs to be performed by an internal auditor, and this is a person who is independent from managing security. And a little bit later on, I'll explain what are the qualifications and who can be the internal auditor. Now, the internal audit needs to be performed at the end of your implementation. So basically, once you implement all the controls and you start running your ISMS, before your first management review, and basically these are the three last steps in the implementation. So internal audit, management review, also closing corrective actions, and then you can actually go for the certification. Now, once you're certified, you'll have to maintain your ISMS, and as part of this maintenance, you'll have to perform an internal audit at least once a year. And this is good for smaller companies, but the larger companies will probably have to perform an internal audit more often, and they can actually do it on, let's say, department basis. So let's say that you have 10 departments, you could do an internal audit of one department in, let's say, January, second department in February, and so on and so forth. There are 6 steps that you need to perform as part of an internal audit. The first one is to define this internal audit program. This is basically where you define how often you're going to do the internal audits. As I already mentioned, this could be once a year or several times a year. Later on, I'll also explain what is the mandatory contents of these documents. The remaining 5 steps you'll have to perform for each and every individual audit as part of this internal audit program. So the next step is to do this so-called document review. This is where the internal auditor has to read all of the documents, meaning all the policies and procedures related to security, and make sure that he or she understands exactly what is required from employees within the company. Because if the auditor doesn't know these rules, then he or she cannot really perform an audit. The next step is for an auditor, based on these documents that he or she has read, is to perform this internal audit checklist. And basically this is a kind of a to-do list on everything that the auditor needs to go through during the audit. And a little bit later on, I'll explain how to create this kind of a checklist. The next step is to perform the audit itself, the main part of the audit. And this is basically where the auditor has to go through the checklist and verify if everything from this checklist is implemented properly in the company. And this is also where the auditor looks for evidence. And I'll give a couple of examples of this evidence that needs to be looked for a little bit later on. And after the audit is completed, the auditor needs to write this internal audit report, which is a formal document where he or she actually shows everything that was found, and also raise these non-conformities, so basically explain what is non-compliant within the company with the requirements. And the final step is to perform these follow-up actions. So this actually happens after the company has managed to close all these non-conformities. So through the process of corrective actions actually eliminate all of these non-conformities, then the internal auditor has to verify if really all of these problems were eliminated. Now let's go through the documents for an internal audit. As you'll notice, some of these documents are mandatory and some are recommended. So the first one is internal audit procedure. This is not a mandatory document, but it's recommended because it defines how the internal auditor is selected, to whom the internal auditor reports need to be delivered to, and so on and so forth. The next document is the internal audit program. This is a mandatory document, and as I mentioned, there you have to define how many of these internal audits you will perform during a period of, let's say, 1 year, or maybe a period of 3 years. But you also have to define in these documents who will perform the internal audit. So if you have only one person, then this is the internal auditor. If you have several persons in the team, then you will have to define who is the team leader and who are the parts of the members of the internal audit team. What is the scope of each audit? So do you cover the whole company with the internal audit, or let's say only one part of your company? And you also have to define the criteria. This means against what are you actually performing the audit. So this could be against the standard itself, but also against the internal documents, against the requirements of some third parties, so let's say requirements of your customers, and so on. You will also have to define what are the methods, and there are basically 3 types of methods. So this is by doing interviews, by finding written evidence, and by doing this personal observation, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute. The next document is the internal audit plan. This is not a mandatory document, and it's different from the internal audit program, because the internal audit plan actually defines the timing on how you perform the internal audit during a particular day. So you could say that you start, I don't know, in the 9 a.m. in the morning by talking to the top management about the objectives, the top level information security policy, and then you continue with, I don't know, security manager at 9:30 with risk management. And then at 10 a.m. you start speaking with HR manager about, let's say, the people controls that you perform, and so on and so forth. So this is how the internal audit plan could look like. And again, it's not mandatory, but it's useful for, let's say, someone who is a beginner as an internal auditor, because it gives more, let's say, assurance and more guidance on what exactly this person needs to do during an internal audit. If you're already experienced, then you're probably not going to use the internal audit plan during the audit. The next document is the internal audit checklist. This is not, again, a mandatory document, but it's highly recommended, especially for new novice internal auditors. And basically this internal audit checklist is nothing else but listing all the clauses from the main part of the standard, so clauses 4 to 10, and also listing all the controls from the Annex A. And then for each of them, basically define what needs to be performed in a company. And you also define in this checklist, then you actually write down what kind of proof have you found, what kind of evidence you have found, and also some kind of comments and your conclusion whether the company has been compliant with this item or not. So you will have this very simple table with 4 columns in it as part of this internal audit checklist. Now let me give you an example on how you could write the items in this checklist. So let's say control 8.13 is about backup. Once you have read your backup policy or some other document that describes how often this backup needs to be done for your systems, then you will actually write down these exact requirements in this checklist. So let's say that you have, I don't know, your server on AWS, and then that you defined in your backup policy that you define that you will do the backup every 6 hours. Then in your checklist say, okay, verify if the backup is done every 6 hours on AWS. So this is how the checklist looks like. The next document is internal audit report, and in this report, in the first part, you define some general things. Who was part of the internal audit team, when the audit was performed, what was the scope, which locations did you visit, what kind of methods you were using. So basically the things that you already defined in your program, now you're reiterating them here. You're also in the second part describing in general whether the internal audit was performed successfully and if the company is in general compliant or not with the standard and with its all policies and procedures. And then in the third part, you list all the non-conformities that you have found. And the final document that is mandatory is this non-conformity form. And for each non-conformity, you basically fill out one of these forms. And this non-conformity describes in more detail each and every non-conformity that you have found. So basically, you write it like this, you define what the requirement was. For example, the company needed to perform the backup every 6 hours according to its backup policy. And then you describe actually what you have really found. So for example, you could say that the backup is in fact performed every 12 hours instead of every 6 hours. And then further, you describe what kind of evidence you have found. and you could say that you found this evidence by looking into the backup logs on AWS. As I mentioned earlier, when you perform this main part of the audit, your task is really to find evidence. And there are three types of evidence. The first type of evidence is actually finding written documents and records about the activities within the company. So backup logs, but also, let's say for, documents, this would be if the statement of applicability exists or not. This is also an evidence in itself. And also, let's say if when you do the trainings, security training, do you actually keep some kind of records, because this is also mandatory according to the standard. So these are the examples of written evidence that you will be looking for. Now, for some activities, there will be no written evidence. So, for example, there is this control contact with the special interest groups, and you might have, security managers checking out every now and then some kind of security forums. He or she informs about various security news and, threats and so on. So in this case, the way to actually find out if these activities are being done is through interviewing this person. And basically by actually asking this person how this is performed, this is the way to find out if a company is compliant. And of course, this is also accepted as an evidence. So the statements from these people are fully accepted as evidence during the internal audit. Another example might be this control segregation of duties. Let's say that you have a senior developer, software developer, actually who's checking the code that is made by junior developers, and that he is actually checking if the code is written in a secure way. So if there is no written evidence, then you can simply do the interview with the senior developer and actually ask him to show you how this is done. And this is also for you a way to find out if everything is okay. The third type of evidence that you will collect is through personal observation. For example, let's say that a company has installed the CCTV cameras around the facilities, and for you actually to find out if these cameras really exist is really to walk around these facilities and see if they are in place. Another example might be, this control are related to clear desk and clear screen policy. So how are you going to check if the screens are automatically turned off if someone is not at his or her computer? Well, you have to walk around the offices and simply see if all the screens are turned off and that they're not accessible. So this is how you actually perform these personal observations. And again, this is also one of the completely acceptable methods for doing the audit. Now the question is, who can actually be an internal auditor? So which kind of person do you need to put in place to perform this kind of an activity? So first of all, you could use someone internally or someone from the outside, someone external. Externally, this could be, let's say, a consultant or some knowledgeable person who is doing this for a living. So if you don't have enough internal resources, you can hire an outside person who will perform this kind of an activity. You could, of course, also use someone internally from your company, and this person may not be in the conflict of interest, meaning that this person cannot be part of the implementation team for ISO 27001. So it needs to be someone who is not actively participating in ISO 27001 project. Very often I get questions, can the security officer be the internal auditor? Definitely not. So it's someone that is definitely in the conflict of interest. No matter who is performing an internal audit, this person needs to have two key qualifications. The first one is the knowledge of ISO 27001 standard, and the second one is knowledge and skills in internal auditing. And there are basically two ways to prove your competency as an internal auditor. The first one is basically through your CV. So let's say that you are performing audits for years now and that you are doing, consulting or something like this for 27001, then it's easy to show your CV to prove that you have both experience in 27001 and in auditing. On the other hand, if you are a beginner, then the only way for you to prove your competency is by going through the internal auditor course and passing the exam. Because by showing the certificate from this exam, this is the only way for a beginner really to show to the certification auditor that you are qualified to perform internal audit. So if you're a beginner, then you will have to go through this kind of a course to actually get these qualifications. This internal auditor course usually lasts 2, maybe 3 days. There is let's say, a choice between classroom type course or online course. There are many training providers that are having this kind of a course. And I'll show you now a typical curriculum, so the typical topics that are part of this internal auditor course. Okay, this is Advisera's ISO 27001 internal auditor course, and when you click here for the curriculum, you will see that there are in total 10 modules. So let's go briefly each module just for you to get a better feeling on the contents. So in the module 1, you basically have these basic topics like what is 27001, the structure, the principles, ISMS, requirements, implementing as a project, documentation, benefits, these kind of things. Let's see module 2. This is going now clause by clause. It explains everything, each and every clause. So starting from understanding your organization and the context, needs and expectations, scope of the ISMS, leadership and commitment, and so on and so forth. Let's see module 3. This is about risk management. So addressing risks and opportunities, risk management process, risk identification, information security risk assessment. This is an exercise. Risk analysis and evaluation, risk treatment, statement of applicability, risk treatment plan. Module 4 is the do phase, or the implementation phase, formulating risk treatment plan, implementing it, operational planning and control, operating the ISMS, and so on. Module 5, check and act phases. So monitoring, measurement, analysis, evaluation, internal audit, management review, non-conformities, corrective actions, continual improvement. And in module 6, you have overview of NXA, so basically overview of people controls, physical controls, technological, organizational controls, and so on. So the first 6 modules are really explanation of ISO 27001, and then modules 7 to 10 are an explanation of how to perform in internal audit. So here you have an introduction to the internal audit, internal versus external, main purpose, requirements, criteria for selecting internal audit findings, non-conformities, observations, major, minor non-conformities, how to organize internal audit procedure, program, plan, all kinds of things that I already mentioned in the video. Internal audit elements, document review, creation of the checklist, internal audit reports. As you can see here, you will learn in much more detail everything that I presented in generally in this video today. Module 10, main audit techniques for finding evidence, sampling, recording the evidence, interviewing techniques, remote audits, auditing integrated management systems, and basically this is it. Hope this was helpful, and to sign up for this free internal auditor course, click this link here and you will be able to go through this whole course without any payments. You would need to pay only for the exam if this is something that you need. Thanks for watching.